All right, so exciting morning planned for day 2, and here to kick things off is Marlene Floyd. Marlene is one of the members of the Exchange's advisory panel and helped develop the programming for Canada's Vote Summit. She leads Microsoft's corporate affairs, public policy, and advocacy efforts in Canada. Prior to joining Microsoft, Marlene was responsible for the execution of national stakeholder engagement and outreach campaigns while serving as the Director of Operations and Outreach to Honourable Justin Trudeau in the lead up to the 2015 election. Marlene has previously worked as a partner in government and public affairs firm and has served as an advisor to prime ministers and several federal ministers on a diverse range of public policy matters. Marlene sits on and chairs several national and community boards and is the founder of Dress for Success Ottawa. Welcome, Marlene.
Good morning, everyone. I specifically asked Sabrina not to read my bio because I always find it slightly embarrassing, but so welcome, bienvenue, Montréal. Good morning, everyone. As Sabrina mentioned, my name is Marlene Floyd with Microsoft Canada. Today, I just want to welcome you here today and do a little recap of what we heard yesterday. It was an amazing first day. First, I'd like to take a moment and to acknowledge our organizers and the people that have brought us together here today. As a member of the Vote Summit advisory panel, I've had the pleasure to work with John, Catherine, and the team for the Democracy Exchange for the past 2 years. I'd like to thank them for their dedication, their perseverance to build this community, and I think that's what it really is, in conference so that we can learn and share from each other and continue to ensure that democracy in Canada remains strong and protected. I think we saw yesterday through the agenda that was insightful. We had valuable insights from chief electoral officers who pulled back the curtain on the challenges faced by election administrations during snap elections. Merci to former Gatineau Mayor France Belle-Île for her openness to talk about the toxicity in municipal politics and how we can rebuild to attract public service. I found it truly enlightening. The Builders of Belonging panel opened our eyes to how institutions like unions, labor, and the military work to foster civil cohesion. During the Think Like a Creator panel, Dave and Alex shone a light on how we can engage the electorate with storytelling, a must when communicating with a digitally minded public. We learned a lot about engagement from Hari Han and from Richard Reeves' respective keynotes. Hari taught us how consistent engagement in relationship building fosters real power. Richard tackled the decline in engagement amongst young men and how we can best respond. Reflecting on the federal election, 2025 brought a flurry of elections here in Canada. And the recent snap federal election has both reaffirmed what we know and taught us some new lessons. Snap elections test our infrastructure, and not just the infrastructure of electoral management bodies. Steps made to expand outreach and clarify communication make all the difference in restoring and building and maintaining trust. We know the reality of the threats of mis and disinformation online, and this has reaffirmed the importance of the role that the tech sector has in ensuring voter confidence. At Microsoft Canada, we are committed to protecting the integrity of democratic processes and ensuring that Canadian voters have access to accurate and authoritative information. Microsoft has worked diligently to safeguard elections from cyber threats and helping to maintain the integrity of election-related information, not just in Canada, but globally. Our efforts include advanced cybersecurity tools, proactive threat intelligence, training programs to political parties, government, civil society organizations, and elections authorities. An example, Microsoft Canada provides specialized cybersecurity solutions like Account Guard and Microsoft 365 for campaigns for Canadian political organizations and political technology vendors. This provides them advanced threat detection, early warning alerts against nation-state cyber actors, and proactive security support. To help Canadian political parties address urgent security issues, this year we launched the Elections Communication Hub, a new service that enables the political parties to communicate their concerns with us and get prioritized support. Now on to day 2. I know you're as excited as I am to dig into the really fascinating agenda and speakers. And so I too am very happy to be here, and I look forward to continuing to work together to foster a strong democracy here in Canada and globally. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Marlene, for kicking things off and for providing us a reflection on day 1 and what we heard yesterday. Your reflections are providing us with the perfect segue to our first panel of the day on foreign interference. What did this look like specifically in last month's election? We've heard a little bit about it yesterday, and I think we'll dig into it a lot more today. Here to break it down is Aengus Bridgman of the Media Ecosystem Observatory and Manon Paquet from the Privy Council Office. Facilitating their discussion will be David Salvo. David is a senior fellow and managing director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. An expert in Russian affairs, he's been analyzing the Kremlin's authoritarian toolkit to undermine democracy at home and abroad throughout his career. He's the principal author of the ASD Policy Blueprint for Countering Authoritarian Interference in Democracies and makes regular media appearances. Prior to joining GMF, David was a Foreign Service officer in the U.S. Department of State, serving most recently as a Deputy Secretary for State-Level Policy Advisor for Europe, Eurasia, and the international security issues. He's also worked on U.S. policy towards NATO and the OSCE, and served overseas in Russia and Bosnia. It served in Russia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Welcome to our panel.
Well, thanks very much, and sorry for that very long-winded introduction. I was not expecting such a bio. But it's great to be here in Montreal talking about what I believe is still a very relevant topic in the context of elections integrity, even if the threat perhaps wasn't as front of mind this election cycle here in Canada. And I'm thrilled that we have Aengus and Manon to sort of shed light both on what the research community is focused on, the policy coordination response that the government undertook, and what we should be thinking about in terms of the evolution of the foreign interference threat in the context of Canadian democracy and Canadian elections going forward. So with that, Aengus?
Great, thank you. Is that working? Sounds like it. All right, thank you everyone for being here. It's really an honor to be given an opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about the work that we do and a little bit about kind of the broader context about the Canadian information ecosystem and what we really mean by foreign interference and how those two things kind of interact and are some shared vulnerabilities. So I think this is gonna work. I think I can go forward. Oh, perfect, all right. So I just want to open this up with the Commission on Foreign Interference. So a year and a half, a commission in Canada designed really to think through, understand, assess all of the intelligence, the research, all of the inputs that we have about foreign interference, and to evaluate and assess the problem and make recommendations. And coming out of that year and a half long process, there was really this very key, clear, clarion finding that disinformation was the threat, that disinformation, not sort of your traditional kind of cash and envelope type foreign interference, but disinformation was the biggest threat. When we talk about disinformation, there's this idea of disinformation coming from foreign states, but really it's about this broader kind of thing that academics and researchers and policymakers around the world are struggling with, and there's been a proliferation of terms, disinformation obviously, but like FEMI, epistemic security, information ecosystem health, resilience, integrity. There's a whole set of different ideas around this, this disinformation idea. But what that really is about is we are existentially concerned about the way information is shared, consumed, and comes to shape people's attitudes and opinions. And what democracies around the world are really concerned about is that information environment, that information ecosystem is very vulnerable. It's very vulnerable to people outside and inside manipulating opinion at scale and producing and distorting democracy to sort of lead to, you know, in the direction of authoritarianism, in the direction of polarization, in the direction of a non-functioning democratic society. So that's really what Commissioner Hogue is talking about. Sort of to help frame this conversation a little bit, I'm going to talk about the state of the Canadian information ecosystem and sort of some of the fairly major shifts that have happened over the last few years, and kind of as we went into our recent federal election and as we look forward into the rest of 2025 and beyond, some of the characteristics, some of the new threats and vulnerabilities that exist. So in the Canadian context, there's sort of four that I think really kind of capture this: countries of interest, platforms, some of the tools, and some of the new actors that are going on. So first of all, countries of interest. If you ask Canadians a couple years ago, which are the countries that are really concerning? And if you ask sort of the Commission and what countries the Commission focused on, it was really India, China, Russia. Those were the three countries that were of major concern. But what we've seen now is this enormous emergence of Canadian concern about the United States. This concern, you can see here on the right hand, this is from 2024 through to this year. The concern of American kind of foreign interference. This is covert information operations designed to manipulate the opinion of Canadians, about 40%. It's now at about 70%. So that's a 30% jump. Anyone who does public opinion research will tell you a 30% jump in an opinion in a year is enormous, is a huge shift in population concern. So whereas China, India, Russia, and India were kind of the main actors in the past, the US has now kind of reared its head, and we can talk a little bit more about that later maybe. Some major shifts in the platforms. I'm just going to show two plots. I have a limited amount of time, so I just kind of wanted to highlight stylistically a couple things. This is the engagement with Canadian news over the last 3 years. So this is about 1,000 Canadian media outlets across social media platforms across TikTok, YouTube, X, Instagram, Facebook. Back in 2022, Facebook and Instagram were the major ways that news was really shared and engaged with by Canadians online. When Meta removed news from that platform, you can sort of see there in the middle of, or late 2023, that almost completely dried up. And now the way Canadians are consuming news online is almost entirely TikTok. To a certain extent, X and YouTube, but really largely driven by TikTok. And so that's just a major shift, and Facebook and Instagram continue to be two of the most used platforms. And so that shift away from news being available on those sites, and even available on sites like X, is an enormous challenge, and platforms are not necessarily acting responsibly. The other one is, of course, this major shift in X. So pre-kind of Musk purchase, pre-renaming, here, this is engagement with Canadian politicians, all members of Parliament. We have this for the candidates, and we'll be releasing that soon. But this is sort of, you see here, Liberal and Conservative prior to Musk's sort of reshaping of that platform, about even on that platform. There was, to a certain extent, a public square. If we look forward to now, it's about double, Conservatives get about double the engagement. It's only on X. It's no other platform. This is not driven by some population level attitude. It's about a migration of Liberals and NDP supporters away from that platform, a slight migration of Conservatives towards that platform, and just some sort of algorithmic change that makes Conservative voices much more amplified. So it's not about Conservative versus Liberal here. This is about some platform level decision that has completely distorted the ideological composition of the previous platform that, to a certain extent, was the public square. So platforms are not necessarily acting responsibly there. The tools have completely changed. Here are sort of two videos. I didn't want to use my time for the videos, but they're just very funny. There's Captain China there, and then Polyev riding a polar bear. These are two AI-generated videos during the election. These are humorous examples, and the reason I'm highlighting humorous examples here is because that's largely what they were used for during the election. Of course, there was disinformation. Of course, there was some AI-generated content that was nefarious, but not at sort of the scale and scope that we were really concerned about. But nevertheless, those tools are now out there either for irony or for malicious purposes. And so here are some of those examples. The tools have shifted. The actors have also sort of radically shifted. And when I say actors, I mean those people who matter in the information ecosystem, the voices that get heard. So here I'm talking about sort of largely very large American voices that have enormous influence in the information ecosystem. So here's Tim Pool, Benny Johnson, Tucker Carlson, and their ability to comment on Canadian politics and talk about Canadian politics and have just an enormous audience. The consequences of this are being felt around the world in different elections, in Romania, in the UK, in Germany, Interestingly, sort of in Canada, to a very limited amount during our election. But nevertheless, the emergent role of the influencer class with opaque funding and a different sort of ethos and set of accountability measures really does mean that the center of power kind of in the information ecosystem has shifted. I can't go back. So those are sort of 4 of the major shifts. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the 2025 Canadian federal election. So we, the Canadian Digital Media Research Network, which is a sort of a set of research organizations around the country, ran this sort of the largest in Canadian history information ecosystem monitoring and response process. And one of the things we did during the election is we identified incidents. So these are incidents of information manipulation in online spaces. So that could be sort of foreign interference or misinformation. It could be generative AI content being used to mislead. It was anything that kind of is manipulating the information environment. Over the course of the election, we evaluated 36 incidents. We flagged about a dozen of them, and there were 2 kind of moderate ones, so no major ones. So this was good. We were sort of engaged in this large public facing exercise during the election, and really we're really out there communicating about this stuff. But generally speaking, there were some foreign interference incidents, and I'll talk about 2 of them, but relatively minor and not material to the outcome of the election. So that's sort of the bottom line. I'll talk about a couple of them, and I'll talk about sort of the capacity going forward there. And then I'll talk a little bit about the bottom line as well. So I want to talk about kind of just 2 incidents and highlight 2 incidents that are kind of interest. And foreign interference is sort of a tricky term. It could be very intentional, or it could just be something coming from a foreign power that has the ability to shift the Canadian information environment. What you see here are 9 examples out of hundreds of ads that ran across social media platforms during the elections. You had them on Facebook, on Instagram, on X, on TikTok. You had them on, to a certain extent, like gaming webs or gaming apps where you would have little bar ads. Basically, these were ads that took kind of Canadian politics, news, and information, repackaged it for cryptocurrency scams. But over the course of the election became very political in nature. So what you have is you have fake news websites. So sort of at the bottom there, the bottom right, you'll see there's the CBC logo. This website is made to appear to be CBC. It's got heavy political content, the Brawl for Canada, Mark Carney versus Pierre Poilievre, in a political heavyweight clash. If you read through this article, it's got political content. It's talking about politics. These ads were seen across social media at scale by Canadians. It's for a cryptocurrency scam, but nevertheless, because it has that political content and because it's being promoted, we sort of deemed this a moderate incident during the election and sort of reported on it extensively. Minor, we can talk about this more maybe later in the conversation, but this is sort of, in my view, a bit of a disgrace that platforms were unable to curb this sort of thing during the election. Just if you went on Facebook and you wanted to access CBC articles to learn about the election, you could not, but you were fed fake AI-generated content pretending to be from CBC that gave commentary on the election. And somehow, collectively, we were sort of okay with this, and Facebook was very okay with it and sort of said, look, this is an industry problem. We don't have a handle on it.
Aengus, we got to, sorry.
Are we out of time?
On my clock, I'm at 12 minutes.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't see the signs. That's fine.
One
okay.
more to go? All right. Okay.
1 minute? Okay. Okay, I skipped over one. We can maybe talk about sort of the Chinese foreign interference during the conversation. But just sort of the bottom line, no major incidents, 2 moderate incidents, none of which materially impacted the vote. But, and everyone in this room is sort of very aware of this, the new normal around elections is claims of election integrity and the misinformation around that. So we saw lots of that. And there's still some of these major trends, and in many ways, sort of disinformation is going to continue to act outside of an election, and people are going to be paying less attention, and so its potency is really there, and this is something to look at going forward. Great.
Thanks, Aengus. So Manon, in light of all the disparate threats in the information space that we just heard about. Paint us a picture about how the government of Canada was coordinated and organized to address this and protect the elections, and sort of what did you learn in light of the public inquiry to sort of be better prepared this time around?
Thank you. This is a question that's very difficult to answer without going deep into the dark bureaucratic corners of the federal government. But just to put a sort of simple picture of the infrastructure that was in place during the election. So since about 2018, 2019, we have what's called a plan to protect Canada's democracy. And that's a plan that includes a broad range of measures, from like building resilience or longer term sort of initiatives, but it also sets an infrastructure to safeguard the election itself. So there's two key bodies that we need to sort of be aware of. So one is the Security and Intelligence Threats to Election Task Force, so the SITE Task Force. So those are the security and intelligence agencies coming together, so CSIS, CSE, Global Affairs, Rapid Response Mechanism, and the RCMP coming together to share information and sort of brief decision makers about what they're seeing about the election. So that's one key piece of the infrastructure. The other one is the Critical Election Incident Public Protocol. So we'll call it the panel. So that's a panel of 5 deputy ministers, including the clerk of the Privy Council, who are mandated to tell Canadians if there's an incident that threatens their ability to have a free and fair election. So it's a very high threshold. They've been in place for 3 years. There's never been an incident that reached that threshold so that a panel had to come out and say something publicly. You mentioned the public inquiry in this. So of course, the last couple of years have been particularly interesting from our perspective, because we spent a lot of time both looking back at what we had done in the previous 2 elections, and continue looking forward, because we need to continue learn and get ready for the 45th general election. So one of the themes that came out of the inquiry is the need for more transparency on the part of the government, which is a very fascinating question, because it's like 2 worlds that are colliding. Like, elections are about transparency. That's the default. Like, we're transparent with our elections. Everything Elections Canada does is pretty much in the public domain. And then you have the intelligence world, where the default is secrecy. So how do you find a balance between those two, where you can share information with Canadians about what's going on while still protecting national security? So in light of that, we really took that into sort of account in preparing for the 45th general election. And then, as the report of the commissioner was coming out in January, the clerk issued some guidance to his fellow panel members. And the guidance really maintained the SITE threshold, but at the same time really recognized the role of the panel in bringing what we call bringing the town together. So bringing all the departments that are involved together to say, like, have we really considered the whole range of activities that the government can take, short of doing that break the glass, make this announcement. And so there's a series of things that can happen there. We've been engaging with social media platform, we've been talking to political parties, but also what was quite unique for this election is that the SITE task force every week was sitting in front of the media in Ottawa and briefing the press, and it was publicly available. Everybody can still watch it online, still on CPAC, and tell Canadians about, okay, this is what we're seeing, and this is like what you need to be aware of. So they talk about different tactics, like the hack and leak. They talk about transnational repression. They talk about some of the incident that Aengus didn't get to in his presentation. So there's been like that greater transparency that we hadn't seen in previous election, and as well, like the Rapid Response Mechanism issued a couple of statements about specific incident that they had seen. So am I saying we've had it perfect? No, but we always approach this file as continuous improvement. So we always have to learn from the previous election, from what other countries are doing. We're going to continue learning from what came out of the inquiry, and continue, so hopefully making it even better for the 46th general election.
Great, thanks, Manon. I will say, as you know, I'm headquartered in Washington D.C. Obviously, I'm American, and the U.S. government prior to this administration organized itself around these issues, largely replicating the government of Canada's response. So Canada is truly seen in this field as an innovator and sort of as the bellwether and by which other governments should compare themselves. So big kudos to the work of Manon and across the interagency in Ottawa. So let me dive in with questions and you'll forgive me, Aengus, for latching on to the part about the U.S. being sort of the biggest concern, which I understand. I'm not going to deny it or dismiss it. But in terms of tools and tactics of foreign actors, and specifically foreign state-sponsored actors, do you see the threat from the United States as replicating the tools and tactics that we long associate with Russia, the CCP, even other actors like India, Iran? Can you shed a little bit more light on what you're seeing specifically from south of the border?
Yeah, it's a really good. So each country has like a different profile, like a different disinformation profile. You can make a little card, and these are the tactics that they use. So China, it's largely transnational repression. Russia's used a variety of tactics, but fake news websites, some sort of trying to flip particular influencers. There's a variety of tactics that they use. The United States is a little bit different in that we have a closely intertwined information ecosystem with the United States. And prior to sort of a lot of the conversation about annexation and tariffs, Canadians relied and continue to rely very heavily on US-based content. And so it's sort of a unique vulnerability. Like, Canadians aren't en masse going to RT English and reading that content to get informed about the world, whereas they are doing that with Americans, and they are doing it with American influencers. And not only that, but many sort of the mark of success for a Canadian political influencer is that they move to the States and they start producing content for an American and a Canadian audience. And they speak with that credibility of another country, and they find a very receptive audience in the United States. So it's a totally different kind of ball game. I think the real concern for us, as sort of watching this space, is that there would be some degree of coordination, particularly on X, but on other platforms as well, that similar to what we saw in the Germany case, similar to what we saw in the Romanian case, where en masse the online community, the excessively online community in the States, would hone in on that election and use it to be hypercritical and hyper supportive of a particular political party. And we just didn't see that really in the election. There's a variety of reasons for that. And there was a little bit of it, but not really to the extent. So that's really like that influencer channel. I think everyone around the world, but especially Canadians, are looking at the United States as, to an extent, a cautionary tale. Not about left and right, but about what can happen in terms of online polarization, and what can happen in terms of when you get a population that is so divided, politically divided, and cannot agree about the basic fundamental facts, political facts of a country. And every other country except the United States is looking, going, oh, okay, well, that's maybe what's coming if we're not careful in this space, if we don't have adequate safeguards. And so Canada, like other countries, is sort of saying, how can we protect against that? How can we make sure our information environment doesn't become polarized to that extent that democracy feels in the United States, again, from afar, barely functional? And so that's really what we're concerned about.
That's helpful, thanks. And yeah, none of that's surprising to my ears. Manon, then, from a policy response, as the threat evolves, there's more threats coming from the United States, but also the overall foreign interference threat was not quite as manifest this election cycle as in the previous two election cycles, let's say. How does the policy response continue to develop? Like, what vulnerabilities are you focused on needing to patch up to make sure that the next federal election is even more secure from whatever's happening south in the border or elsewhere?
So we really always look at this in a way that there's always stuff to learn, and we have to get better. The environment, like the threat environment, just evolves so quickly. Like we're definitely not in the same place in 2025 as where we were in 2019. So we need to continue to learn. So one way we're doing this, so just to give a sense of the panel, like in the last, like since January 2024, like they've been meeting regularly to discuss those issues, and meeting with people from civil society, like you and your team were able to come a couple of times, but also like from other countries, like there were discussions with what was happening in Germany, what's happening in France and the UK, so we had those discussions with those other countries, and we keep engaging with our partners to understand how they prepare, what they've done. So for us, sort of what's coming now, so obviously we still need to, the election was about a month away, so we still need to reflect of how things happened. There's some reporting that will come out of it that will be made public in terms of our reflection on this. And we also need to sort of continue thinking about how to implement the recommendations of the whole inquiry. Like the report just came out in January, so it's still brand new. One of the key areas that she focused on, and Aengus pointed at really directly with a quote about this information, is that monitoring of the information space. What more can we do? What is the role of the government in that space, and how far is the government going in this? What's the role of civil society, and how do we build that capacity in civil society to also play that role? And again, we're learning from our colleagues abroad. The French is really have leapfrogged in front of everyone when they created Viginum a few years ago. So we have to also look at those models and see what can be implemented in the Canadian context.
Thanks. And Aengus, I'll pivot to you based on what Manon just said. I'm curious your view on who in Canada should be playing that role of monitoring the information space. I will say, in the United States, for example, government wouldn't touch that, right? It was incumbent on us and civil society to do that work. I mean, government now is destroyed. There's no organ of government that's focused on these issues at all, and civil society is being dismantled. So this will not exist in the United States in a year or so. But in Canada and in other democracies, this field is growing. So do you see this as your community's specific role? Do you think there's a role for government in tracking the information space and informing citizens? How do you see that?
It's a great question. I think the transparency of the site task force, despite some specific criticisms, was really good. I think this fundamental idea of transparency and better conversation about this. I've started working in this space in 2019, a massive increase in sort of literacy and discussion and awareness and conversation about this issue. It's really been quite something. And so that literacy needs to be in civil society. It cannot be in government for a variety of reasons, but there's a huge credibility gap, right? That is the idea that government would be. I mean, we saw the cautionary tale with the Disinfo board in the United States, right? And Nina Jankowicz and that the firestorm that occurred to her and overall. So we don't want that. I think that civil society and research organizations can play a very big role, but we're still trying to figure it out. So through the Observatory, through the Canadian Digital Media Research Network, we're doing this. We're collecting data at scale, reporting on it, sharing it with other academics, and trying to make this work. And in many ways, we're successful in that we had a very large presence during the election, and we were able to communicate these things very well. But we're situated in a university, and in a university, I mean, any academic in the room, we strive to be pertinent and relevant in the public and to communicate our research. We take an extremely long time to do things, and we're very careful and attentive, and we focus on replicability and open science, and that's a challenge to do that while trying to do really what we were doing, which was incident response or a rapid response or communicating. So we were pumping out a report every week. And so if you're putting a report out every week, it means you sort of have 3 working days to actually do it. And then your data concern, so you want to check your data. So you really only have a day and a half to do the analysis, and you can front load some of that development work and some of those tools. But ultimately, you're checking things at midnight the night before, checking the data. And so I don't know if academics are uniquely well suited to that, but yeah, it absolutely does need to be kind of civil society outside government. There's that heavy role, and I think in the Canadian space, I would say 6 years ago we did this big project. The first it's called the Digital Democracy Project. And there's this digital ecosystem research challenge associated with it. So it was a central data collection apparatus, and then about 20 teams from across the country, and some from the States and abroad as well, tried to study a particular part of the information ecosystem. And it was a really interesting model and demonstrated to me very strongly a huge challenge, which is that you have the computer science community, the data community, and you have sort of the political science, communications, social science community. And those two, there's not that bridge to the extent that it's needed right now. And so that's a learning thing. And I think actually it's a challenge in government as well when you talk about there is some data available, there is some analytics that's done, but you need to have both the combination of substantive expertise about disinformation, about politics, about what matters, and the technical expertise. And so, that's a long-winded answer. I do think it should be in civil society. Generally, universities are very strong partners, but they can't be the only one there. They can bring some unique expertises, and other civil society groups have a large role to play. And I will say that they did. I mean, we had a coalition for information ecosystem resilience during the election. There were about 10 groups across the country that were doing this. And so I think like the transparency from site this election and the work, the coalition's work, these are two things that really haven't been done at this scale in any other country. And so in many ways, Canada is leading in this space, but we have a long way to go.
With the fragmentation of the information space and the changes in certain platform architecture, like on X, what concerns you about reaching Canadians? Like, is there a certain segment of the population that you think it either must reach or is unreachable? Like, how do you sort of see that information landscape as it continues to become it's the echo chambers they multiply and everyone sort of retreats to their bubbles? Are there any sort of strategies that you've noticed either from a policy side or a research side that you think might move the needle even a little bit to sort of increase trust in the process, increase trust in democratic governance and institutions, and sort of close vulnerabilities that allow foreign actors to exploit sort of our open space? I open that to both of you. Yeah.
Oh, that's a tough question, but I think I will stay in theme of the discussions from this conference yesterday. I think the answer is offline. It's to going back to meeting people, working with partners in the communities, and building that trust at that level, and not trying, like, I don't think as the government we are necessarily that effective in terms of our online communications, but I think like going back to working with communities and working with like people that are on the ground and rebuilding that one-on-one dialogue. And that's really was a theme that was discussed in many of the panels yesterday.
Yes, offline, but also online. This is something we're still learning. I think everyone is still learning, but like, so there is an increasing fragmentation. I didn't talk about it too much in the slides, but one of the, at least for me, one of the most interesting things in this election is something like 27% of Liberal candidates opened a Blue Sky account and were posting on Blue Sky. The percentage was 0 for Conservative candidates. You are seeing this migration. In the past, we talked about echo chambers on platforms. So everyone would be on Twitter, but like you would see certain content, I would see certain content. There was an echo chamber effect, maybe overstated, but there was an echo chamber effect. What do we do when one political community is on X, one political community is on Blue Sky, another one is on TikTok, and then, like, you get the segmentation completely by platform, and that's occurring to a certain extent. And so how do we combat that? And probably, like, this was a big theme of sites, is trying to be communicative, and the stretch goal for this election was going out in front of the media once a week and doing that, and that was unprecedented and an enormous lift, I imagine, to even make that happen. But the next logical step is saying, okay, it's not just going through media, it's not just through CPAC, it's going out on the platforms and being active and engaging in the information space in like deeply uncomfortable ways. And I say deeply uncomfortable because, I don't know, Isabel's gonna laugh at me. So we had this like big plan to get on TikTok during the election. And like we were gonna go and we were gonna start communicating really well. And every week we would get to Friday noon, we'd have released the report and be like, okay, time to do some TikToks. And we'd all look at each other and go, oh no, like how are we gonna do this? How are we gonna produce this type of content? Because it's so uncomfortable and it just doesn't feel right. And we gotta get over that.
But that also raises a really good question, which is if you may not be the right messenger to deliver that content to reach hundreds of thousands of Canadians, and you talked about like the influencer challenge, you know, are there partnerships that government and researchers can be forming with outside the box type of, you know, organizations or individuals who have that megaphone, who can reach people? Like, I mean, with respect, I don't think that you necessarily should be on TikTok, and that's you, the collective you, not you.
Fair enough.
Aengus Bridgman.
I wouldn't watch it.
I wouldn't want to be on TikTok either. I wouldn't be successful, so it's not personal. But yeah, like clearly we have to be working with the people in society who do have that reach. Any reflections there?
This is like the on-the-ground stuff, I think it gets back a little bit to the on-the-ground. We think of like on-the-ground as like, I don't know, whenever I hear somebody say on-the-ground, I think of like, okay, I'm going to go to like Dauphin, I'm from Manitoba, go to Dauphin, Manitoba, go to the community center and like invite people and talk. Like that's what I think. I don't know why, that's a ridiculous bias. Obviously, it's more sophisticated than that. But meeting the influencers and having those one-on-one relationships with them and connecting with them and I mean, to a certain extent, you see this actually as we've been following the election, like the election process misinformation after. What's really interesting and like really connected with me is that a lot of the influencers are saying, hey, actually, no, like I understand how this works. This is why I understand. And so, you know, if like Elections Canada wants to reach the Canadian population at large, but one way to do that is if one influencer with a large audience really understands the election process, is invited in to do it. And I think Elections BC did something like this with the media during the last election, where the media was invited to go do a walkthrough of every step of the process. You do that with influencers. You do it with the people who shape the information environment. So they can have concerns, they can raise questions, and they will. But if they really fundamentally understand the sweat and tears and logistics and the warehouse and all of that process and are curious about it, then it's going to be much harder for them to spread that misinformation, and that's not going to happen. So that's touching grass, that's going out to the community, but in kind of not going to Dauphin. Nothing against Dauphin. Maybe something.
I mean, I'm not going to share any big secret by saying that we are sometimes a little risk-averse in government. So you know, working with influencer, particularly in the context of an election period, I don't know. I'm pretty sure that someone, after a couple of weeks, will find out that that particular influencer made a partisan comment about a certain party like 10 years ago, or like it's that sort of like giving the control away to someone else to pass on our messages is very risky, because then you have to ensure that the credibility of the person and the nonpartisan nature of the person. So I think we've gotten a lot better at putting information out there, but we still have to sort of find our ways to go that next step in making sure that people have actually look at this information that we are providing, right? So there's still some work, I think, for us to do in this space, but we have to be very careful about it, because at the end of the day, like that trust in the government, which, you know, some of the numbers yesterday were still quite positive. We need to maintain that, and we need to take that really seriously. So I think being risk averse is also playing in our favor in a certain extent in that sense. So we have to be very careful, but we also have to find better ways to reach people where they are.
I'm mindful of our time, so I'm going to ask one last question, and I'll apologize again because it's informed by my American perspective. But this panel is talking about what has happened and what might happen in the context of Canadian elections. But foreign interference and mis and disinformation, information manipulation, these are threats that affect democracy every day, divorced from an election context. And in the States, what we've learned is that when you link these issues to electoral contexts, it's extremely hard to penetrate with certain audiences, you know, to break through, to shift opinion. But when you make the issue relatable to people's lives and livelihoods, and you change the framing of talking about these issues, there's an ability to penetrate. I'm curious, you know, either in your research or your unit, which from what I understand, your mandate's beyond just protecting elections. Have you thought about how to make this vast and sort of nebulous issue set more digestible for Canadians, so that when you're talking about it, it's not seen solely through the prism of, you know, who you're going to vote for, or, you know, what sources of information you should read necessarily. Any thoughts about, any parting thoughts on that aspect of it?
I mean, you're right that our team is looking at things beyond the election. Obviously, in the last few months, the election has been the clear focus, given where we were. But as part of that plan to protect Canada's democracy that we have in place, there's a few pieces that are quite focused on building that resilience. And like I'm thinking about the digital citizen initiative that our colleagues at Canadian Heritage are managing. It's to sort of help build that civil society capacity, that develop some tools to help Canadians understand these issues. We've also developed our own, like some like toolkits on foreign interference and disinformation that are now available in 11 languages, with guidebooks about how to counter disinformation. So we have those. We try to sort of spread that kind of information to build that awareness and resilience among Canadians, because, I mean, from our perspective, like, we'll never stop the malign actors from doing their things. We can, we have some intelligence tools that I'm not quite sure how they work and all of this, but the resilience of Canadians is what is, I think, the most important from our, like, to build.
I can just end by saying, like, people don't like being lied to. They don't like being manipulated. They don't like being gaslit, right? Like, they don't. People get really pissed off if they find out that they have been. And so that's actually a very, like, in some ways, our job is made easier by that. You are being lied to. Here's here's the hook. You're being lied to, right? And so to use that hook and then tell these stories, and we started doing our work outside the election. I mean, we haven't gotten that hook just right, but I think, especially the influencer class, but just generally people who spend time in online environments, at some fundamental level, they are interested in understanding the truth about what's going on. And there's some partisanship, there's some biased reasoning, there's all of these dynamics. But even underneath all of that, nobody wants to be truly lied to and manipulated and to feel duped. And so that's a great hook. That's a way we can get into this outside of an election. And it's probably a more effective, we're not talking about partisanship, we're not talking about left, right? We're just talking about people are lying to you. You probably want to know that. And just repeating that message over and over again and helping to build that skepticism and reasoning when you're in online spaces is something that hopefully we can keep doing.
We've covered a lot of ground in a very short amount of time, so please join me in thanking Manon and Aengus.